koji je inače kolumnista za New York Times i autor ove nove knjige Ponovno otvaranje muslimanskih umova. Ali inače oslanja se na islamsku tradiciju i osvrće se na filozofiju te pravo. Knjigu je na bosanski preveo Mirnes Kovač, novinar i politički analitičar koji se bavi naročito politikom Bliskog istoka i Balkana. Razgovor će se održati na engleskom, ali nemojte brinuti o tome zato što bit će obezbeđen i prevod na bosanski.
Zahvaljujem. Prvo, dobar dan i dobrodošli svi. Good morning to our guest, Mustafa. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bookstan, 7th International Literature Festival being held here in Sarajevo. The topic of this year's festival is the state of siege. Allow me to first introduce our guest. Mustafa Akyyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has also been a frequent opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion in the Muslim world. He has authored dozen of books. The latest one actually is being discussed today here, Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom and Tolerance. It was published in 2021, and the same year it was translated into Bosnian. After that book, Mustafa also wrote, as he says, his own manifesto, Why as a Muslim I Defend Liberty. Before that, Mustafa authored a very interesting book, Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of Muslims, in 2017. And before that, his actually first book in English was Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, 2011. According to a popular podcast, The Thinking Muslim, it defined Akyyol as probably the most notable Muslim modernist and reformer. In July 2021, British magazine Prospect listed Akyyol among the world's top 50 thinkers. Assalamu alaikum, good morning, Mustafa, and the floor is yours.
Alaikum salam, Yunus. Thank you so much for this. Pozdrav svima to you and everybody who's listening us at this event. First, let me thank you, of course, and Bible for publishing the Bosnian edition of my book. We just made a paperback. I was really happy to see that the second edition came. Let me thank the organizer of Bookstan for inviting me to this important event. I wish I could be there physically, that was the original idea, but because of a lot of logistical issues, I couldn't come this year. Inshallah, maybe in the future. Thank you, Mirnes, and it's been a really honor and pleasure to work with you in having the book in Bosnian, and I'm glad that a lot of interest came in Bosnia. Prominent scholars read the book, discussed the book, shared their messages with me. I was humbled and honored to hear that. I don't claim to be any religious authority. I'm not a mujtahid, I'm not an imam, I'm not a cleric. I don't have to give any fatwas on any of those issues. But just as a Muslim, thinking on the issues of our ummah, our global Muslim community in the 21st century, and both as a political observer and also a religious contemplator, I had the question that many Muslims had, like what went wrong? Like, why were we a great civilization 1,000 years ago when we were the most creative, open-minded, tolerant, pluralist civilization? why things went down in the past few centuries. And there are a lot of people who are unhappy with the state of the Muslim world for good reasons, and I'm one of those. People give different answers to this question, of course. My thought, my observations, both in my home country, Turkey, and around the world and around the Muslim world, have convinced me that we have not been able to cultivate some of the important human values, universal values like freedom, like human rights, and reconcile them with our religious tradition, although our religious tradition has the seeds of freedom. So in my book, I try to reconcile these ideas of universal human rights, religious freedom, freedom of speech, which we sometimes hear from Western speakers, sometimes with cynical or hypocritical maybe motives sometimes. But are these values our values as well as Muslim values? And my answer is yes, but to be able to say yes, you have to think through a lot of issues, because we have a tradition which took place in very different conditions, right? Which took place where the world was full of despotic regimes and empires. And at that time, actually, we generally represented these universal values. But we need some rethinking. And by making these arguments, I rely on prominent scholars, from the late Fazlur Rahman Malik, who was really an eye-opener for a lot of theologians, including myself, and many in Turkey, actually, whose works have been very enlightening on me. From some contemporary ones, from Khalid Abu Fadl to others, let's say Asma Barlas, who's speaking, we're working on women's rights, for example, and how to read the Quran with a new perspective, which is different from you may find in some medieval jurisprudence books, but which is actually true to the original intentions of the Quran. So my book brings all of these discussions together and argues that toleration, rationality, which is a universal human, something we can share as all humans. These are not alien to Islam, quite the contrary. We have their seeds, we have their roots in Islam, but we have to think them through. So that's a basic argument. And you know, I don't have to summarize the book to you, but for those who may have heard this for the first time, that's what the book is about.
As I've been told by organizers, we have around 50 minutes, so it's enough time. We will begin our talk with a question of Islam and freedom, which actually dominates the book and your interest generally, if I may say.
Yeah.
What is freedom and how is it perceived in Islam, in early Islamic tradition? What are the main issues regarding freedom in today's Muslim world?
Definitely. Well, people give different meanings to the concept of freedom. My definition, which is, I think, the definition for most people, is, or in the liberal tradition, is simply lack of coercion. Freedom is, in that sense, defined negatively. If nobody is forcing you against doing something against your values and your will, then you're a free person, right? If nobody is putting you in jail for your ideas or for your beliefs, or forcing you to do practices that you don't want to do, forcing you to have a certain dress code or have a certain idea, if you can express yourself as freely without fear from persecution, especially from the state, but also from the community, from other people, then you're a free person. Of course, freedom is not unlimited in any society, because you may do things with your freedom which might infringe on the rights of other people. So that would not be freedom, because you will be violating their rights. Right? Nobody's free to steal property, right? Nobody's free to kill people or harm other people. I mean, the simplest saying about that is that your freedom ends, your freedom to throw a fist ends when somebody's face begins, right? We cannot. So there are rules required by living together in society. But besides those, if you're not harming anybody else with your beliefs and values, if you can pursue your way in the way you want, then you are mostly a free person. And there are studies who measure freedom in the world. For example, Cato Institute, where I work at in the past 4 years, publishes the Human Freedom Index. So it shows which countries in the world are most free and the least free. The least free countries are dictatorships like Venezuela or North Korea or Syria, where you have also, of course, affordable civil war, but a very bloody dictatorship. Whereas freest countries in the world prove to be Norway, New Zealand, a lot of the European countries, but there are differences between European countries as well. So in Islam, is freedom valued? Well, I believe yes, actually, because when you read the Quran, there are many important verses that actually call for freedom. The word freedom itself is not used in the Quran, but you see a call for a lack of coercion. Of course, the most powerful of that, which is probably every Muslim knows, is La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion, which we can discuss later, more in detail, but because people have different interpretations of that. Or, for example, if you read one of the, again, early, this is a Medinan verse, by the way. If you read some of the early Meccan verses, especially, like to you your religion is to me mine. This is what early Muslims said to the polytheists of Mecca. So you have your religion, we are not coercing you against it, but we want to have ours freely. Or there are verses speaking to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, saying, "O Prophet, you are just a preacher. You are not a compeller. You cannot force people to believe." So these are, I think, powerful messages in the Quran, which do not use the word freedom, but give the basic sense of freedom. And I wrote an article about this. Liberty was Islam's first call. Liberty and freedom are, similar terms generally used interchangeably. And Islam first wanted in Mecca the right to be practiced and the right to be preached. So Muslims in Mecca said, we are monotheists, we don't believe in idols, we want to live our religion and say it out loud. So that is freedom of speech and freedom of religion right away. The polytheists didn't allow them. The polytheists persecuted them. They killed Muslims. They tortured Muslims. So Muslims had to flee. They had the first migration to Abyssinia, a Christian kingdom. Prophet Muhammad, by the way, said, go to Abyssinia. That's a just kingdom, which shows us today that any country can be just or unjust regardless of whether it's Muslim or something. It was a Christian kingdom at the time. So I see the value of freedom there. However, when you look into that's very interesting, and these are the problems we have to speak about. When you look at, for example, the tafsir or exegesis tradition, you will see sometimes notes in classical tafsir, the commentaries of the Quran. You may see that many of these verses that I just quoted, and there are others, especially in the Meccan period, you will see a note that they are abrogated, that they are mansukh with the Arabic term, which means they are still in the Quran, but they don't have a function in legislation. Why? Because classical jurists, most of them, not all, but most of them, took verses about war against the polytheists as the universal norm, and they thought that those verses that came later abrogated these more peaceful and pro-freedom verses. And in my book, I get through these discussions, and I show that, well, yes, these scholars thought like that. It was an imperial world, but that's not an interpretation that we Muslims need to really subscribe. And quite the contrary, you could say that, and that's what I believe in. Those values of religious freedom and non-coercion were universal values of Islam, and war with the polytheists later came only as a historical condition, and it didn't have to be that way, but Muslims had to fight because they were oppressed in the first place. So instead of taking the war verses as universal norm and abrogating the pro-freedom and tolerant verses, I believe it's the other way around. I mean, those verses gave us universal values of Islam.
As you already mentioned, the very term that denotes today's concept of freedom, hurriya in Arabic, does not appear in Quran, nor in early traditions. As a concept, it is not even classified among traditional main principles or maqasid al-shar'iyya. What are your main arguments that you elaborate in the book that can be basis for promoting freedom within Islam and practically within Muslim societies. I will ask this question by the title of your latest book. Why, as a Muslim, you defend liberty?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think as a Muslim, I defend liberty because I think the lack of liberty leads to enormous human suffering, right? People suffer in the jails of authoritarian regimes all across the world, not just, of course, in the Muslim world, but from China to Russia. You know, there are so many dictatorships in the world today. Some of them are also quite aggressive. But also in the Muslim world too, we have many authoritarian regimes, and people can suffer because of the lack of freedom. Sometimes it's the society itself. I mean, in Pakistan, it's a country I love, but almost every month, some innocent person gets targeted by angry mobs for have committed blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad, which is most of the time, almost always on false charges. So when you don't have freedom, you have human suffering, you have injustice, you have persecution. And I think that these are values that are against human conscience, right? And certainly the core values of Islam. Now, going back to your question, which is very helpful and important, the maqasid al-sharia, you referred to the intentions of sharia. This was, of course, a certain science developed by some classical scholars, the most of which, important of which was Imam Shatibi from Granada, from Muslim Spain. The sharia has many commandments, of course, that's Islamic legal tradition, but he emphasized that there are values that these commandments uphold and listed them as famously the 5 principles: the protection of religion, life, property, lineage, and the intellect. However, people maybe might not be aware of that. Ibn Ashur, a scholar from Tunisia in the 20th century, he added hurriya actually to these principles based on a Sharia perspective. I mean, there are clauses in the Sharia about freeing slaves, because if you do something, you have to free a slave as an atonement. So he took this as the intention of the lawgiver, that is God, to actually free people. And that's why he actually included hurriya, that is freedom, to these maqasid, to these intentions of the Sharia. Now, I believe the word Sharia, the word hurriya may not have been used. Liberalism isn't used in the classical tradition. It's a Western term for a political philosophy of upholding freedom. However, this is not an obstacle for us to connect the dots and see the values. And this has already been done on another important political concept, which is democracy. Today, you will see a lot of Muslim thinkers around the world advocating for democracy, rightly so. And in my country, Turkey too, and in Arab world, especially against authoritarian regimes. Some of them are people you can call Islamists. For example, Rashid Ghannouchi has been very important a voice, and I quote him respectfully in my book, advocating democracy, right? Well, is democracy found in our classical fiqh books or the Quran and Sunnah? No, but there are some inspirations and bases for it. For example, the early caliphs, the first 4 caliphs, were elected not with a hereditary monarchy as it happened later under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, but with bay'ah, that is like the community coming together and deciding on somebody. This was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was something similar to democracy in the sense that the person who will rule the community came with consensus, with consultation, shura. So, for example, Quranic concept of shura, that is consultation, has been taken as an inspiration for democracy. And I'm trying to make a similar case with freedom, that is freedom of speech and freedom of religion, or equality before law, which might not be the exact concepts you find there, but we have the sources for it. Why sources? Because Islam, the fundamental goal of Islam in the beginning was transformation from polytheism to monotheism. All these political and social values were ingrained, they were brought in, but that was not the fundamental battle. But those values were there, and today we Muslims, I think, should aspire to advance those values.
At the very introduction of your book, Reopening, you talk about your own experience with so-called religious police in Malaysia. Tell us more about the Quranic instruction, as you already had mentioned it, La ikraha fi din, or there is no compulsion in religion, and how it is used and misused in the interpretations of Islam today.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I mean, those who take my book will probably see that introduction chapter, and I would recommend really reading that chapter, which really because tells you in a nutshell what I'm discussing about in this book and why it's important and why there's a problem of freedom that we have to really highlight. This is a personal experience. I mean, I went to Malaysia in 2017. I was in the US still again then. I went from US to Kuala Lumpur, which is the other end of the world, to give a few lectures because my books have been translated in Malay. I've spoken Kuala Lumpur a few times before that. I was hosted by Islamic Renaissance Front, which is a organization that promotes human rights and freedom from Islamic perspectives, founded by pious Muslims. One of the lectures was on a sensitive topic, apostasy or ridda. People who are familiar with Islamic law would know that apostasy, which is publicly renouncing and changing your religion, is considered as a capital crime in classical books of jurisprudence. Like if a Muslim says, I'm a Christian now, I left Islam, and that in itself becomes a crime, and that person is taken to court and asks for repentance, and if the repentance doesn't come, that person is executed. Now, this has no basis in the Quran, but it is in jurisprudence. In fact, that's the interpretation of Sharia, right? And in this panel, I said, yes, it is there, but this had a context in the medieval world. Abandoning your religion, especially in the context of early Islam, abandoning your religion meant almost always automatically joining the enemy that you are fighting with. So it was seen as political treason, which doesn't have the same concept, same meaning in the modern world today. Right? People change their religion; they live in peaceful. They live as citizens in peaceful societies. So it's a very different context. Second, there's no basis for this in the Quran. There's a hadith attributed to Prophet Muhammad. It's a hadith with one narrator, which is always open to be questioned, especially from the Hanafi perspective, right? Ahad hadith with one narrator. And second, third, I said, well, actually, there is a very strong statement in the Quran, La ikraha fi din, or there is no compulsion in religion, which should be our guiding light, on all these discussions. So this is compulsion. If you say people, you'll be punished, if you don't come back to Islam, that is compulsion, and that goes against the Quran. And finally, I said, that doesn't make sense either, because if people don't genuinely believe in Islam, you cannot make them believers. You can make them hypocrites, right? And there's no value in that. And that's one of the key arguments I always make. I mean, if you don't have freedom, you will not end up with a pious society. You will end up with a hypocritical society, which we see a lot. I mean, in countries like Saudi Arabia, let's say, or Iran, for that matter.
Even if I may, lately, Saudi Arabia has actually pulled this rule out of its legal system. Namely, the decision was made that ahadith cannot be basis for capital punishment and so on.
Yeah, I heard those news, and those are welcome developments in Saudi Arabia. They just have a lot of problems with political freedom as well, but we can discuss that separately. Anyway, I gave this lecture, and people loved it. I mean, Kuala Lumpur, a lot of people applauded, and people were leaving. And I had to emphasize that religion should not be policed, because it's a matter of heart and conscience. It should be based on sincerity and not coercion. So I was leaving, and then 5 serious men came into the lecture hall, and they said, "Are you Mustafa Akyol?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Did you say religion cannot be policed?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Good, we are the religion police." So they showed me their cards, and their job is literally defined as religion enforcement officer, because in Malaysia you had this religious police force called JABI. it's a HISPA force, that is public monitoring of religious practices and punishing people for committing public sins. Like if you don't fast in Ramadan in Kuala Lumpur, if you're a Muslim, the police might come and take you to admonish you, or maybe to fine you, or maybe to jail you for a few days. And I think these are wrong practices. Anyway, so, and they said we have to ask you questions about your talk. They did, and they let me go that night. But the next day, I woke up and I heard that they want to interrogate me through a prosecutor. My host said, you know, you have a flight tonight, you should go and we'll deal with this through lawyers. I followed the advice, but when I went to the airport, I was arrested by the religion police. And they came and they said, you violated the law which bans teaching religion without tevliya, which is permission, which was actually never about academic conferences. It was about preaching in mosques. But they somehow used that law in a creative way, and they arrested me. And they said, you know, the punishment is 2 years in jail, and so on and so forth. So luckily I was released, and that is thanks to some diplomacy I mentioned in the book. I should thank Turkey's former president Abdullah Gül really for calling the Sultan of Malaysia, and that helped me a lot. I tell that part of the story as well. But one thing was interesting to me was, I was like, oh, I appreciate that part, although my book was banned later. I checked how the Malaysian authorities interpret La ikraha fi din, because they were angry at me for quoting La ikraha fi din. There is no compulsion in the Quran. I mean, they noted that, he quoted that. I checked their translation in English, the website of Jakim, that's the official religious ministry. And I saw that they did a little bit editing in the English translation. It writes, there is no compulsion in religion while entering Islam. Like that part, while entering Islam, is not in the verse. They just add that in parentheses. And why do they add this? Because when you say there's no compulsion in religion, this seems to go against the apostasy laws, which I'm against, right? But since they believe in the necessity of those laws, they temper with the verse a little bit. Well, it's not in the Quran, it's a later interpretation imposed on the Quran. And some other translations do that too. And here we have the discussion about, you know, should we have Islam based on freedom, no compulsion, or certain acts of compulsion, are they necessary? So in the book, I begin with that story and saying that, well, why do these people believe in coercion? Because there's a jurisprudence that they rely on, but is that jurisprudence really eternally valid? Let's Muslims discuss this. So that's the beginning story of the book.
There is one topic in your book that is particularly interesting, and it touches the reality of modern appliance of religion in Muslim societies, especially the conservative ones, and especially the misuse of or even abuse of religion for political goals. You talk about the issue that was raised by some Turkish theologians about the so-called immoral piety. One of them was Mustafa Öztürk, a popular theologian and opinion writer, quoted in your book, and I will quote this: "For the next 40 to 50 years, we Muslims will have no right to say anything to any human being about faith, morals, rights, and law," he wrote in 2017. "The response, 'We have seen you as well,' will be a slap in our face." Another prominent theologian, former Mufti of Istanbul, Mustafa Akyol, also lamented about the growing gap between religiosity and morality. In the past, he recalled, conservatives like him would typically argue there could be no morality without religion. But now, he wrote, he had to argue there should be no religion without morality. Can you tell us more about this gap, not just in the context of Muslim world, but generally? That split between faith and morality, which nowadays seems to be a major problem in all established world religions. For example, just recently, we have seen Russian patriarch Kirill openly supporting aggression against the sovereign country Ukraine, being a voice of war and not, unfortunately, voice of peace. Not condemning killings and not calling for peace, among which is nonsense. I'm a Christian Orthodox brother.
Well, when religion loses its fundamental value of upholding justice and rights against any injustice, and rather becomes the justification of injustice, it becomes ugly, and it also pushes people away. And of course, I mean, you mentioned that in the context of the support by the Russian Church of the totally inexcusable aggression by the Russian dictator Putin against Ukraine. And this is just one political example, but there are many examples of this. And I think religion, any religion, is at its best when it defends the oppressed people against any oppressor, when it defines humane values. But it's really ugly when it is used as a justification for hatred, violence, persecution, dictatorship. And I mean, the quotes thank you for sharing from my book, are from a few Turkish scholars, because in the book I also sometimes bring a perspective from Turkey, my own country. And the deeper story behind that is that, I mean, Mirnas, some of our friends there may be familiar with the political history of Turkey, but until the 21st century, in Turkey, generally, Islam was not a very dominant political force. Turkey's more conservative, pious Muslims were generally not the ruling part of society, especially in the state and state institutions. This changed dramatically in the past 20 years. I mean, Turkey turned upside down. And there were a lot of problems in the old Turkey as well. For example, because Turkey had a secular ruling class, which didn't appreciate freedom that much. That's why they banned hijab, for example, the headscarf in university campuses for many years. And I was with a very French-inspired interpretation of laïcité. And I myself was one of the very active vocal opponents of this ban. I said, this is a violation of religious freedom. Women should be able to wear whatever they want to wear in the campus, and that can certainly include a headscarf. So that was the old Turkey. There were problems with it. And there was some expectation that, and there was a lot of corruption in politics and all that. There was some expectation that when the pious Muslims, conservative Muslims, practicing Muslims come to power, if they have the state, they will be better. They will be more just. They will be more fair. Why? Because they fear God, and because of that, they will be more moral, more ethical, and so on and so forth. Well, it turned out to be not the case. What we have seen in Turkey in the past 20 years. I mean, ask to anybody besides who's not a partisan, like an observer. We have seen staggering corruption, persecution, authoritarianism. Yes, we have an elected government, but a government that really divides the society between the enemies within and the true citizens. We are its own supporters. And even people who support the government, intellectuals, they will say, there's corruption, unfortunately, there's nepotism, but still it's our government, and they will justify it somehow. But some religious thinkers, like the ones you quoted, those theologians whose work are important, they write newspaper columns too. They said, I mean, we have failed the ethical test. When people look at us, they don't see an ethical, upright group of people who are trying to do justice no matter where it goes. Instead, they see a worse than old elite group of people. And religion in this landscape isn't coming to the fore as a higher value that keeps all us in check. It becomes as a battle cry against the other group that you hate. We are the good Muslims, you're a bad one, so we will persecute you, right? We will wipe you off. You deserve everything. So it becomes a justification for group narcissism, as I call it, instead of a sense of value. Now, this happens, of course, in other religious traditions as well. And I think this is one of the key reasons for secularization. I mean, people think that if we are not coercive enough, societies will become secularized. Whereas I think societies become secularized when they look at religion and they don't see anything admirable. Right? I think this is happening in Iran in the past 4 decades. I mean, Iran is an Islamic republic, coercive in many ways, force women to wear the hijab and ban things like alcohol. A lot of people who visit Iran think that this coercive approach and some of the injustices have made a lot of the Iranians go away from the religion, being total secular people, atheists. Some of them convert to Christianity. So if you combine Islam with arrogance, with coercion, with corruption, people move away from that. And I think that's the lesson. And that's why an understanding of Islam, which is ethical, where ethics is the highest goal. And by ethics, it's not just about, oh, we don't drink alcohol, we don't eat pork, we wear hijab. So these practices, these are, of course, Islam has practices. But those practices have a value, have a meaning. They're supposed to train you to become an ethical human being. So are you also just to other people? Are you also fair to other people? Are you controlling your anger? Are you controlling your lust to dominate? So if you lose those ethical values, religion becomes an empty vessel and generally turns into, and I discuss why this has happened. And this is not just happening in Turkey, it's happening elsewhere as well. And as you said, this is the right thing. For example, I mean, I see sometimes some Catholics in America these days complaining about freedom. I mean, there's a new trend among a few Catholics they call them integralists. They're the Islamists of Catholics, if you will. They say, no, religion should be actually combined with the state. You see seculars, when you leave the society free and secular, it goes to secularization, I mean, in terms of a distance towards religion. Well, I would say look into some of the scandals in the Catholic Church. Maybe you yourself have not been very good in representing your values. I think we religious people should look into what we represent, but to people who look from outside, before blaming them as, oh, these are godless seculars and they're not pious people.
Let us return to Muslims, and I think we have 20 minutes to the end of this discussion, and I will leave a floor for possibly someone from the public to ask. It would be fair. For the last 2 centuries, as Ali Alavi, the author that you are quoting at the beginning of your book, has discussed, there is evident longing or yearning of Muslims for the so-called golden age of Islam. Can Muslims regain that magnificent civilization again? I would now ask, in the words of Bernard Lewis, what went wrong? As he explored that clash between Islam and modernity in his book. How is it that situation in wider Muslim world, and how is the situation in this regard in wider Muslim world, and how about Muslims living in the West?
Thank you. Well, speaking of modernity, we should be fair, and I think emphasize that modernity came to us Muslims, not always, but quite often, as colonialism. And it is only normal that we reacted to it, right? I mean, France, for example, today speaks about human rights and universal values, blah, blah, and that's nice, but France came to the Muslim world by colonizing it with brutal means. I mean, the destruction of Algeria, the plundering of Algeria for 130 years. And a lot of Muslims have reacted to that, understandably so, rightly so in many cases. But we should also understand that that's the ugly side of what we call modernity. But at the same time, there was an idea of abolishing slavery, giving equal rights to everybody, including Muslims. And that's why today, yes, Europe has a colonial legacy that we should always criticize and keep in check today too. But when Muslims migrate from North Africa or Middle East, they don't want to migrate to China or North Korea. They want to migrate to Sweden or Germany or Canada or US. Why? Because these are the countries with not just economic opportunities, but rule of law. I mean, you will not be scared of the government there, right? You can have a decent life, you can be good Muslims. There are a lot of religious freedom problems in France, for example. I don't want to minimize those, but especially in the Anglo-Saxon countries, religious freedom is an established value. So there is a better side of the story as well. Now, compared to this, how do we look? We should honestly think about that. And I think the grandeur of the medieval Islamic civilization, which made many Muslims, which made many minorities migrate to the Muslim world because it was more free. I mean, Jews, for example, repeatedly escaped from Catholic Europe to later Protestant Europe too, at times, to the lands of Islam because we were more free. We gave them more religious freedom. Now people escape always from the Islamic world to the other way around, and we should just see why. I think the grandeur of the medieval Islamic civilization was tied to various things, but one key thing which don't maybe come across to some Muslims, we were open-minded. Early Muslims didn't shy away from studying Aristotle or Plato or Galen and these Greek philosophers. They didn't say these are kuffar, these are unbelievers, so their books are worthless, so let's burn them. No, they studied it. I mean, they were open to learning. They had the confidence enough to be open to different civilizations and make a mix and amalgamation of that. Even from Jewish or Christian roots or Indian traditions. I mean, we got a lot of things from other civilizations, we improved them, and that's how civilizations progress. Once we became insular and thought that we know everything we need to know about the world, then you stop progressing, right? That's what happened. And when modernity came with colonial ruthlessness, and we were shocked, and we didn't know what to do with it. And that has led to a lot of different movements. The Islamist movement is a reaction to that. To the hyper-secularist movement in Turkey, which was acting wrong in limiting religious practices, is a reaction to that as well. I believe the right reaction was to embrace human rights, democracy, limited government, free markets, the liberal democratic model, I think, which is rarely tried in the Muslim world. Turkey tried at times, and those are the times Turkey really made progress and found some peace of mind.
I would now ask if someone wishes to pose a question or some comment. Professor Mato Zolkic, a renowned Bosnian theologian, Catholic theologian.
Thank you for this unique chance to hear you directly. In the beginning of your discussion, you mentioned that you are not a professional cleric, not an imam, but a Muslim intellectual. I must thank you for this approach or this way of presenting Islam to Westerners. I understand your book, The Muslim Jesus, and this one, because you do not use the professional expressions of clerics. Second, the question. I don't know, did you meet during your visits to Sarajevo Professor Fikret Karčić, who was a law scholar, and once I attended his lecture to students of law in Sarajevo, where he spoke about Muslim countries and their present regimes. And he questioned, is there any really Muslim country where the government would be just? Now, today's Muslim countries. Would you agree with him?
Thank you so much, sir, Father, if I may say. You're very kind, and I'm trying to do my best, and I'm happy to hear that you were aware of my book, The Islamic Jesus, as well, which gets into a lot of theological discussions about Islam and Christianity. I mean, and by the way, yes, I mean, Bosnia has very important Islamic scholars whom I quoted in my book, and certainly Professor Fikret Karčić is one of those. I have great respect for him. He kindly wrote a blurb that is actually on the cover of my book or in the introduction. So, and I agree with him that there is hardly, any Muslim majority society we can today look and say, this is a country that we Muslims can be proud of. Well, if there's one, I would say it's Bosnia. I mean, honestly, I know there are a lot of political issues in Islam, and it's not about the government, but in terms of the Islamic tradition, Bosnia is the freest Muslim majority country, as I documented in a report that I prepared for the Cato Institute, Freedom in the Muslim World. Bosnia and Albania, these are freest in terms of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. So people in Bosnia, non-Muslims, don't live with the fear that they might be targeted with some false accusation of blasphemy, which happens in Pakistan, obviously, right? Or that you fear that you criticize the government and you will get lost in a jail cell somewhere, which would certainly happen in Syria or some Arab countries, other ones, or Iran. So indeed, I mean, it is hard to judge the whole Muslim world. Should tell you that. I mean, there's a spectrum. There are truly oppressive regimes. There are other Muslim societies, from Indonesia to Morocco, where you can't say they're 100% perfect liberal democracies, but actually there is considerable amount of freedom. Jordan in the Arab world or Lebanon still doing better compared to others in terms of their freedom levels. My country, Turkey, you could look at, say, Turkey. You know, Turkey is a success story in many ways. It's just so much political polarization and, unfortunately, hatred between different Turkish camps. And I myself have been the kind of collateral damage of that sometimes, and trying to say, well, please don't hate each other that much, and being hated by everybody, fanatics of all sides. It's in a crisis, but the very reason that the Islamic world is in a political crisis, which has sometimes something to do with religion, is only a reason to work on ideas of democracy, human rights, freedom, toleration, rule of law. Let's not forget that Christian Europe, found its way to these ideas only after terrible crises, right? The idea of religious freedom emerged in Europe only after the incredibly bloody wars between the Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries. John Locke, wrote a letter concerning toleration because the Protestants in England were persecuting each other, let alone the Catholics. The Protestants were persecuting each other for being heretics. And he threw this idea that the government should tolerate everybody and do not interfere. Catholicism for a long time perceived religious freedom as a very secular French anti-religious idea. But, I think the Catholic tradition took a very important step with Vatican II, with the Declaration on Human Dignity, which is, I think, a very important development, which we Muslims should look into. I'm glad Bosnia is out there. Please keep it safe and sound. And it's a country that I deeply love, and inshallah, I'll be happy to visit soon.
Thank you, Mustafa. Anyone else wishing to ask? Thank you. Before thanking you and closing this session, okay. We have very shortly, please.
Also, I should give up immediately if it's short. So thank you for this address, and thank you for your book. I have one comment and one question. First, Muslims in Bosnia are, in cultural or civilization terms of speaking, the westernmost Muslims. I put this in parentheses because in those terms, we are the westernmost Muslims in the world. Not only Bosniaks, but also Kosovan Muslims, Albanians, and stuff. So I would love to hear your reflections about current position of Muslims in Western Balkans, as well as some, I don't know how to say that, maybe guidelines or some your reflections on how we should proceed, given that we are torn between the European, I will be free to say, hypocrisy, also with your home country, Turkey, emerging as trying to them to establish themselves as a political player in our society. and what to do with radical political Islam in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our friend Mirnes Kovac is often targeted by radicals, and I will say that these are political radicals, not Islamic radicals. So I would love to hear your reflections about it. And one more comment. The book is, the title is Reopening of Muslim Minds. But we have a problem with Muslim sense. We have a problem with them struggling to perceive, among others, your message as well. So maybe a couple of sentences about this. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm glad to see the audience as well, thanks to this. Thank you for all joining. I mean, I'm not the best person to comment on Bosnia and its politics. I mean, Mirnes, my good friend there, weighs no more than me, and I'm sure all of you too. Here's what I can say as someone who really deeply loves Bosnia from the 90s. I'm married to a Bosnian, and my children, you know, speak Turkish and Bosnian and English. In Bosnia, the first thing about Bosnia is that let's keep it safe, right? Bosnia suffered horribly in the 90s. It faced a genocide in Srebrenica and Sarajevo and other places. Bosnia lost 200,000 of its good people, children. So keeping Bosnia safe from conflict, from aggression by fascist forces who really have hatreds that are deep-seated is the most important thing. And I would be cautious of this Russian onslaught on Ukraine for somehow changing the geostrategics of the region and bringing Bosnia into a more precarious situation. For Bosnian Muslims, I mean, I think in Bosnia, the mind to reopen minds is maybe less about Muslims, but other groups that are really using their religious tradition as a banner of hate. So I would look into the Serbian Orthodox tradition, where you see a very strong combination of, unfortunately, political hatred and religious institutions and traditions and symbols. There's a militant nationalist tradition on the Croat side as well, as far as I know. This is not to criticize the peaceful and tolerant citizens there, but I think the forces that have threatened peace in Bosnia are mainly ultra-nationalists in Serbia and in the Republic of Srpska, and also ultra-nationalists on the other side. Bosnians have been generally victim between these forces. Of course, I'm sure there are issues about ethics in Bosnian politics. There are, I'm sure some of the Bosnian Muslims can look into some of the discussions there and find it relevant. But by and large, Bosnia is already a free Muslim majority country. Like, I mean, the problems I'm discussing in the book, apostasy laws, Bosnia doesn't have those, and Bosnian Muslims are not asking for those. Blasphemy laws, nobody's asking for those. I think for Bosnian Muslims, the book can be helpful in seeing problems in Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, and because as Muslims, we all care about the whole Islamic scene. So in that sense, it can give a perspective. But Bosnia is already the freest Muslim majority country, and whose Islamic traditions have made peace with liberal democracy, with toleration, with pluralism for a very long time. And we owe that partly to the Ottoman tradition, partly to modernization, partly to Bosnia's long history of having a civil Islam that is not a part of the state. So the primary goal I would have about Bosnia is to keeping safe and sound. And I already show in the book Bosnia as a good example that Muslims may look into as a society where Islam is based on not coercion but freedom. There are coercions sometimes from other forces on Bosnia, and I'll pray to see Bosnia safe from those threats.
Thank you, Mustafa. I will now conclude this session. Thank you very much for your open talk. Ima, there is a famous journalist, Amir Zukic from N1, the director of N1 television. Please, Amir.
but I'm not so famous. Never mind. Mustafa, how do you comment on recent verbal attacks on you that came from the individuals pretty connected to the ruling SDA party in this country regarding your opinions about sexual freedoms? Actually, they tried to connect you with the recent incidents in Sarajevo, trying to explain that your fault, actually they accused you directly for connecting sexual freedoms with Quran and Islam.
Thank you for that question as well. Unfortunately, Turkey is filled with political tension and poison, and sometimes it spills out of Turkey, and people with a grudge against me because I criticize the government here and there may turn their ire against me. Unfortunately, this happens in Turkey all the time. Bosnia may have seen a very little dose of that actually recently in some of the remarks by the individual or by the publication that you alluded to. I was actually misrepresented. I mean, I didn't say, in my book, I don't discuss any of these sexual issues if people are speaking about the LGBT issues. And my stance on that, if you ask me, is Muslims have the right to preserve their family values and to disapprove certain relations in society. It could be homosexual or LGBT, other Muslims, other sexual orientations. And Muslims can say, this is against our religious tradition. They have the right to say that. But also, people who identify as LGBT individuals have the right to live a safe life as individuals. I mean, something can be against Islam, but you know, you can say it's against Islam to drink wine, but your neighbor drinks wine, but you can still be a good neighbor with him, and he has the full rights to be citizens. So some people in the LGBT community sometimes say, how dare Islam doesn't approve our way of life? Well, they can't say that. I mean, Islam approves or doesn't approve. Religious traditions have their values. It's not just LGBT. I mean, Islam doesn't approve unmarried sexual relations with heterosexual people as well. So this is, I mean, you can't expect an imam to say that's okay, you know, right? They will have a moral position and they will say, this is what we believe is morally right. But it comes to the question, the matter of coercion. You can have your values, but how do you deal with other people? And I think people who are LGBT, from the LGBT community tradition, however you define it, they have been attacked in different parts of the Muslim world, or in Serbia or Russia as well. By the way, there's a very strong machismo there. And these are all wrong, and they should be confronted. And they are citizens with a certain inclination, which I believe comes from their birth. So you cannot also blame those people for that. So you should try to understand. And from the religious perspective, I think our also clergy should, by saying, they can say this is not approved, but they should look in with a matter of perspective of mercy and understanding as well, instead of a hate-filled language. So that's all I would say. And my book doesn't really discuss this issue. I don't have a very strong position on this. I just would defend here, as in any other issues, the right to live their lives freely without persecution from society. I mean, I would defend you if an atheist is attacked. I would defend the right of the atheist. That doesn't mean I'm promoting atheism as such, right? But I would be defending the right of every human being, regardless of their religion, worldview, and their sexual orientation as well. And the reason why this was put in a way connected to my book, as if my book is only about this issue. I think there is some political propaganda going on, which unfortunately, as I said, is a spilling of the Turkish political landscape, which is full of the ethical problems I mentioned in the book, into the Bosnian media scene. But I was happy to see that not everybody took this seriously, and there has been a strong critic of this approach recently in Preporod. And I think people, instead of making judgments about me or my book, should just read the book and see what it is really about. And I would like to see serious criticisms of the book, but not lies or misrepresentations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you all for coming and being part of this session. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you again to Bookstan and all our friends there.